Good afternoon and good evening if you are joining us from across the Atlantic. I am Magda Tedder and I'm the Schwidler Chair in Judaic Studies here at Fordham. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to our last event of the year, but one that is celebrating our own colleague Daniel Soyer and his most recent book, Left in the Center, The Liberal Party of New York and the Rise and Fall of American Social Democracy, which came out this year from Cornell University Press. And we do have a discount code, which I will send you in the chat for. Daniel will be joined by Robert W. Snyder, a distinguished scholar of the history of New York City. Daniel Soyer is professor of history and Jewish studies at Fordham University, where he teaches US history, American Jewish history, modern Jewish history, and the history of immigration in New York City. He's the editor of most recently, The Jewish Metropolis, New York City from the 17th to the 21st century, which came out last year. And we discussed as our last event last semester in December, and you can view it on our YouTube channel, which I will send you a link to as well. In addition to his most recent book discussed today, Left in the Center, he has published The Emerging Metropolis, New York Jews in the Age of Immigration, 1840-1920, which he wrote with Annie Poland and which won the National Jewish Book Award. And also Jewish Immigrant Associations and American Identity in New York, 1880-1939, which was the winner of the Saul Wiener Award of the American Jewish Historical Society. He's currently co-editor of the journal American Jewish History. Robert W. Snyder has devoted his career to writing and teaching about the history of New York City. He's Manhattan Borough historian and professor emeritus of American Studies and Journalism at Rutgers University. He's currently editing a documentary history of the COVID pandemic in New York. Professor Snyder writes for both scholars and the general public in books such as Crossing Broadway, Washington Heights, and The Promise of New York, and All the Nations Under Heaven, Immigrants, Migrants, and the Making of New York. He has consulted for both the Museum of the City of New York and the Smithsonian Institution. A former Fulbright lecturer in American Studies in Korea and a member of New York Academy History, he currently lives in Manhattan. Before I hand over the screen to Daniel and Robert, I want to express my thanks to all of you for joining us throughout this year. Over 3,000 of you have joined us in our 30 events live, and nearly 8,000 of you have watched the same events on our YouTube channel. I also want to thank for your generosity and support. All these events would not be possible without you and without the generosity of the Knapp Family Foundation, the Pickett Family Foundation, and so many other individual donors. I am also grateful to Siobhan Verletza, who this whole year made sure that all events were publicized and advertised, and also that we all received the links that we need for these webinars. So now, without further ado, let me hand over the screen to Daniel and Robert.
Thank you. Dan, could you start by telling us how you got interested in the topic of the Liberal Party?
Well, I think there were a couple of reasons. One, as you know, the introduction, Magda mentioned that a lot of my research has been about Jews in New York, and some of that has been about the politics of Jews in New York, especially in the labor movement and in socialist movements. And the Liberal Party was a kind of outgrowth of that. It's a little bit later than I was used to writing about, but it was a kind of attempt on some of the same people to kind of insert themselves more into the mainstream of politics and have a real kind of influence on local politics, state politics, national politics. So that was one thing, to see how they made that kind of transition. The other thing was that, well, so frankly, kind of academic historians like our colleagues, those who have written about New York and about some of the political issues in New York and elsewhere, I felt that they really, they were very much taken by the romance, as even Gornick put it, of American communism. So they really play up the communists in New York, and or the kind of periphery of the communists, those kind of liberals and progressives who are kind of in the orbit of the Communist Party and worked with them quite a bit in elections and on issues. And I kind of want to see, what about the others, right? What about the other liberals, the other socialists, social democrats who are anti-communists? What effect did they have in the city? So
what led you to do that? I'm curious, because that's really going against a big historiographic trend.
Say the beginning. What led
you to embrace the leftists who are not communists in your analysis? Because that's really going against the historiographic trend for a while now.
Well, I guess partly it had to do with some research I did about communists. So they had this, they were absolutely out front on things like racial equality in the United States and in the city. But they had this one huge blind spot, right? Which was the Soviet Union and Stalin, and they supported the Soviet Union, and they took direction from the Soviet Union, really. So I wanted to see, was it possible to support civil rights in New York, support labor rights in New York, without also supporting, one of the most repressive and mass murdering regimes in the world. And people mention them, so every book mentions them, but doesn't really explore them. So that's what I wanted to do.
The Liberal Party comes to rise in the 1940s, and that's a really protean period in American politics, it seems to me. There are all sorts of things going on within the Democrats and also, with Dixiecrats and liberal Republicans. What was it about that moment that made so many things come to rise, including the Liberal Party?
I think you actually have to go back to the 30s, because of course the Liberal Party split in 1944 from something called the American Labor Party, which despite its name only existed in New York State. It was founded by the same people who founded the Liberal Party in 1936. And in 1936, these were, again, people with socialist backgrounds, labor backgrounds, kind of independent liberals, radicals. They wanted to support Roosevelt, right? They wanted to support the New Deal. So they wanted to support Roosevelt. But who was the biggest New Dealer in New York? Biggest New Dealer in New York was LaGuardia, and he was nominally at least a Republican. So that was one thing. The other thing is, you mentioned Dixiecrats. So they didn't want to join the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party was the party of white Southern supremacy and the party of Tammany Hall and big city machines. So how do you do this? How do you, support Roosevelt, support Governor Lehman, who was a Democrat, but also support LaGuardia, and also make it clear that you're not in league with the Dixiecrats or with Tammany. So in New York State, there's a peculiarity, which is that a candidate can run as the candidate of more than one party at a time. And this was around before that, but people hadn't really used it much. But they noticed this and they say, well, we can have our political cake and eat it too, right? We can have our own political party, a Labor Party, like in Britain, like in Canada had kind of a, Labor Party still does. And, but we can back Roosevelt when we want, Lehman, the candidates of the big parties, but run our own candidates at the same time. So this is what was going on in the 30s. In the 40s, what prompted particularly the Liberal Party is that a pro-communist faction seized control of the American Labor Party, and they didn't want anything to do with that, and they split away. But the 40s continued to be, like you said, a protean time. There was a lot of talk about third parties. You know that in 1948, Henry Wallace, the former vice president, ran for president. Didn't do as well as they'd hoped, and nothing really came of that party. But there was a lot of talk in various circles about a new party. A. Philip Randolph talked about a new party, and the Liberal Party was involved in that effort. In 1945, the Liberals were involved in negotiations with Wendell Willkie, the former Republican candidate for president. Maybe he would be their candidate for mayor, but he then died suddenly, and so nothing came of that. But there was a lot of talk about kind of, what liberals should do and party realignments and things like that.
What was the place of Jews in the Liberal Party?
So this is an interesting question. So this was really, it was close to being a Jewish party, okay? The chair of the party was always, I say always, from the beginning in 1944 till it started to kind of disintegrate in the 1980s, the chair was always a Gentile intellectual, right? A professor or a minister, usually a Protestant, in one case a Catholic, preferably a Protestant, and preferably someone from the Midwest, actually, or maybe Massachusetts, something like that. So that was always the chair, right? But the guys who were really pulling the strings were these Yiddish accented trade unionists, most importantly, David Dubinsky from the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and Alex Rose from the Hatters Union. But if you look even more deeply, like if you look at the executive committees of the county committees, it's like 90% Jewish. Few Italians, because the garment, it was like it came out of the garment unions. So mostly Jews, some Italians, here and there, some Blacks, some Puerto Ricans, but, and some others, right? But mostly Jews.
How did those people who founded the Liberal Party express their Jewishness? I mean, what was it? Ethnic? Was it religious? How would you describe it?
We describe it as ethnic, right? This is not religious. This has nothing to do with Judaism, right? This is not, some of the people may have heard, people talk now about tikkun olam, and they go to a liberal synagogue, and people talk about how, like, the social ethics of Judaism, but this is none of that. This comes out of a secular, first of all, a lot of them, it wasn't that important to them necessarily. It was just that they were Jews. This is what they were. It was an ethnic sense, an ethnic sensibility, an ethnic identification. Some of them, like David Dubinsky, in his youth, he had been a member of the Jewish Labor Bund in Poland, but in the Russian Empire, which was a non-Zionist Jewish socialist party, Yiddish-speaking party. And he retained some affection and connections actually with the Bund in Poland between the wars. And Rose was a labor Zionist, a socialist Zionist. So he had that kind of Jewish politics. So, occasionally, there might be some Jewish issues, the foundation of the State of Israel, which they supported. The issues might come up in New York. But there's a sense of maybe some interest that Jews had, but it didn't come out of any religious sensibility. I should say that there were a few, there were a couple of Reform rabbis involved in the Liberal Party, so they may have had a different perspective, but they were not the majority perspective in the party.
Did they absorb much from the immigrant socialism of Jewish immigrants in the early 20th century?
They were the Jewish socialists of the early 20th century, grown a little bit older, right? So in the 19th century, the socialist movement in New York was mainly German. But when the Jews started coming from Eastern Europe, the Yiddish-speaking Jews in the late 19th century, early 20th century, they became really the social base, right, of the socialist movement in New York. There's no question about that. And in the second decade of the 20th century, the Socialist Party, for a minute there, looked like it might become a real political force in New York. It elected a congressman, Meyer London, who was a Jewish immigrant from Russia. They elected him from the Lower East Side, right, which was then a Jewish district. And they elected a number of state legislators and members of the city legislature, the Board of Aldermen, from the Socialist Party, one municipal judge from the Socialist Party. All of these people were from Jewish districts. Not all of them were Jewish. There was one guy, August Klessens. He was from a Swiss Catholic background, but he was socialist state senator, I think, from Upper Manhattan. And he said of himself, he said, really everyone in the district was Jewish except for him, the janitors, and the cats. And he wasn't sure about the cats. And even Klessens, by the way, and this is something interesting, he was married twice. He was widowed and he remarried. Both his wives were Jewish. And this is not really a coincidence, because once you fell into this milieu, I mean, that's who you meet, right? I think he met at least one of them at the Rand School, which is the Socialist Party school. So even Klessens was kind of a little bit acculturated into a Jewish ethnic kind of culture. Klessens was he wrote a great, I recommend his autobiography. It's a great read. He learned a little Yiddish, but he had a little trouble because he liked to mention Kugel in his speeches. Kugel is a Jewish studies event, but people may not know, is kind of a potato pudding, very popular in Eastern Europe. So he talked about Kugel, but some people come up to him and they would say, Comrade Klessens, you're saying it wrong. It's Kegel, right? So he got a little confused. So he asked his wife, right? It was Jewish. So what's like, they're telling me it's Kugel, it's Kegel. So she said it's really the same thing. It's just it's a dialect. It depends where you're from. Some people say Kegel, some people say Kugel. Same thing. So then he would go out and make a speech and he would say the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans is the difference between Kugel and Kegel. In other words, nothing.
One of the points.
20 years later, though, he's making a speech for Roosevelt, right? Because he's one of these socialists who went with Roosevelt in the 30s with the American Labor Party and later the Liberal Party. And someone who remembered his old speeches said, but Comrade Klessens, do you still say the difference between the Democrats and the Republicans is the difference between Kugel and Kegel? And he said, yes, but Roosevelt is at Simis, which is kind of carrot thing.
I mean, one of the things that strikes me about your history, particularly in these early decades, right, of the American Labor Party and then the founding of the Liberal Party, that the political concerns that shape these people are at once very local and very global, right? They reach from New York City politics to the New Deal, but then also ultimately to international issues that eventually become wrapped up in the Cold War. How does this dynamic shape the Liberal Party as it emerges?
Well, even in their socialist phase, they were electing, one congressman, but mostly they were electing people on the local level, and they were interested in nuts and bolts of local government, And, but in the 1920s, for a variety of reasons, they couldn't elect anyone anymore, And so I think by the 30s, they're trying to kind of figure out a way which they can have a real effect on politics and still maintain their independence. And that's where they come to this kind of independent satellite kind of minor party kind of thing, right? But they were always very kind of trying to keep a balance between ideology, and a lot of them always thought of themselves as socialists, even to the, through the 1960s, let's say. But to be practical, they wanted to have an effect, and they wanted to have a kind of pragmatic kind of politics as well. So they were always kind of trying to maintain this balance. The anti-communism comes to them early, right? Because this was like a civil war in the garment unions in the 1920s and in the socialist movement in the 1920s. And by the end of the 1920s, these, the core group of the liberal, what's later the Liberal Party, is very, very anti-communist. They see the communists as wreckers. They see the communists as unprincipled, opportunists, interestingly enough, and as kind of their enemies, and so when the Cold War comes around, they're like veterans at this, right? They've been fighting the communists for 30 years. They always thought that they were, when like McCarthyism comes about, they had a kind of strange relationship because they hated the communists. They didn't think the communists were a legitimate political group. They thought they were agents of a foreign power, and so they kind of agreed that maybe they shouldn't be teaching, right? Because they're not free agents. Can't think for themselves. They're taking orders. On the other hand, they thought that they could tell who was really, a communist much better than the McCarthyists could, right? And they thought there's nothing wrong with like small c, there's nothing wrong with radicalism. There's nothing wrong with like communist ideas. Something wrong with the Communist Party because it's an agent of a foreign power. They thought they could recognize the difference between these people. But the McCarthyists, whether they were local or national, no, they couldn't. They couldn't do that. And so the Liberal Party would defend some people accused of, things, being fired from their jobs and so on. But also they would kind of try to root out communists in the unions. And even, they were divided, I think, on the Feinberg law in New York that banned communists from teaching and so on.
If they had one set of rivals on the left, they had another set of rivals within the world of the Democratic Party. Tammany Democrats, people you'd call regular Democrats. How did the Liberal Party people define themselves against Tammany Democrats and regulars?
Well, they were always against Tammany. And this, again, they inherit from their tradition. When you say regular Democrats, so that was Tammany or the equivalent in the other boroughs, right? So they always saw themselves as the opponents of these machine Democrats who they regarded as corrupt and also kind of conservative, And Tammany was never really that enthusiastic about Roosevelt, for example, So they saw themselves as opponents and rivals of these forces. Same time, since a lot of their strategy was trying to push the big parties in one direction or another, they often found themselves negotiating with Tammany and sometimes backing members of Tammany if it seemed either that individual was, they thought, progressive enough and in keeping enough with their outlook, or if it was expedient or necessary, for them to, let's say, if it was a statewide election, to get enough votes for governor on their line to keep their ballot line. So they're always trying to balance this pragmatism, and that comes in play with their relations with the Democrats as well.
Yeah, I'm struck by how in the 1950s, the Liberal Party is forming up and it's getting to work and it has real strengths. But at the same time, there are liberal Democrats and liberal Republicans in New York State at the same time. So how did the liberals distinguish themselves from their counterparts in the two other main parties?
Well, I said, we are consistent liberals, and we're not members of this Democratic Party, which again, through the 50s, right, into the 60s and even a little bit beyond, were the party of white supremacism in the South. We're not that. We're not Tammany. We're not the party of big business like the Republicans really are. But yes, there are liberal Republicans and liberal Democrats. You want to know who to vote for. Look for our seal of approval, right? We'll work with the liberal Republicans. We'll push the Republican Party locally to nominate the liberals within the party. We'll push the Democratic Party locally to nominate the liberals within the Democratic Party. And one liberal activist in the 60s, there was like a master's thesis or something, and he quoted this person he interviewed. He says, statewide in New York State, we cannot guarantee a Democrat that he will win if we endorse him. Right? We cannot guarantee to a Democrat running for statewide office that he'll win if we endorse him. But we can guarantee that he'll lose if we don't endorse him. Right? So suck off several 100,000 votes. And so this means the Democrats have to listen to the liberals, right? They have to nominate someone who's acceptable. I would say that the Republicans in the city were the, whatever it is, converse, inverse, whatever it is, that a Republican could not get elected citywide unless he outflanked the Democrats from the left, and he did that by getting the liberal nomination.
There's an irony to the history of the party. It's committed to reform. It's committed to good government. Yet, as I read your book, throughout its history, it's run by bosses. How does that happen?
Oh, yes. Yes. It was always run. It was, from the very beginning, it was a top-down affair. So it's hard to say how does it happen, because it was from the very beginning. It was Dubinsky, it was Rose. Now, at the beginning, it was also some of these intellectuals, these professors at the Teachers College, there were a bunch of them, at Columbia. And Dubinsky and Rose took them very seriously. And so they were also part of it. But, there was always a fairly closed circle of who was really running the party. I think this comes from their trade union experience. It's like you don't want to things get too wild. You want to keep control, discipline. And it also comes a little bit from their experience of battling the communists in the ALP and the unions, that they don't want things to get out of hand. They want to keep tight control over this. So it was always, it was never really internally that democratic, and it certainly got more solidified later on, but from the very beginning, it was kind of a top-down party.
As you move into the 1960s and civil rights becomes a bigger issue in New York City, racial justice becomes more prominent, the demography of the city is changing. How well did the Liberal Party do at recruiting African Americans or Latinos?
Not too well. Okay, so I should say that, going back to the 40s, there were some African Americans, especially in the party. Some of them had were important roles in the party. There was Benjamin McLaurin, who was a lieutenant of A. Philip Randolph. And then there were some people that might surprise people who were at various times, a little bit involved in the party, may have run for office, party support, like Pauli Murray, right? Ella Baker, right? In other words, there was a group of anti-communist kind of radical Black civil rights activists who crossed paths, at least, with the party. Now, McLaurin was very involved. The other ones, they may have, and Pauli Murray, by the way, she was a member of the Liberal Party Law Commission, and she helped to write, or she wrote, I think, a statewide statute that banned discrimination in housing, so that the Liberal Party supported. So, in other words, the Liberals supported, one of the first things they did in 1940, when they existed in 44, was send a big delegation to Albany to support the I always forget Ives Quinn, Quinn Ives law,
Quinn,
which was
sure.
Ives Quinn, which was very important early law banning discrimination in employment. So they had a record on civil rights. But, and in the 60s even, James Farmer was a vice chair, and they supported him when he ran for Congress. But the 60s rolling around, I think the biggest thing was really, like you said, the demographics of the city are changing, and they don't really keep up. You know, they have a few Blacks who are maybe in the garment unions, or you know, and a few Latinos getting in the garment unions, but they don't do an effective job of reaching out. They did have an organizer, a Hispanic organizer for a while, but they never really, I think, demonstrated to the people that they were really, really, really open to bringing in new blood. I think that was really the main thing. And so they, you know, by the 1960s, the demographics are changing. Their base, their constituency, Jewish working class, the Jewish lower middle class, is shrinking, you know, and they're not doing a good job of bringing in new blood.
What are their biggest achievements? Politically.
That's a good question. Well, they're politically, I mean, electorally,
yeah,
their biggest achievement by far was electing John Lindsay mayor. He, of course, ran as a Republican in 65, but he lost the Republican primary in 69, and he was reelected solely on the, I mean, they invented a little other party line to be on, but really basically on the Liberal Party line alone. So they elected like a mayor, you know, of New York City. I think that's the biggest thing. But they also helped to elect, on their own line, they also elected president of the city council in the 50s, Rudolph Haley. But, you know, they helped to elect governors, Averell Harriman. They helped to elect senators, Javits, people like that. Later, they didn't back him when he first ran, but later they backed him. So they had a lot of electoral successes. They elected a few city council members. Yeah.
When the Liberal Party was effective in a statewide race, say for governor or for senator, were they drawing on any basis of support upstate, or were they pretty much a New York City party?
Mostly New York City, but they had pockets of support upstate, you know, mostly in the big industrial cities, Buffalo, Rochester, places like that, you know. And, you know, some of the places where there were like Jewish, New York City Jews who had moved out, maybe Rockland, places like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, so they had some pockets. And I would say later, if you look at the vote totals, it started to even out more. I think that was more a function of it kind of really shrinking in the city, becoming more just a thing people voted for as a kind of, it says liberal, I'm a liberal, I'll vote for the liberals, you know, instead of really mobilizing their people. Oh, one more thing upstate. For a while, they had a very active group in Ithaca. Mm-hmm. A lot of people connected with Cornell and some labor people. So you know, kind of around it, what's the county? I forget, but
Tompkins County. Yeah,
Tompkins County. So they had an organization there that was quite active. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, by the time you get to the 80s and 90s, the Liberal Party looks very, very different from the one, you know, that was born decades earlier. What happened to them? I mean, they're endorsing Rudy Giuliani, for example. Yeah.
So by that time, they first endorsed Giuliani when he first ran in 1989. So by that time, people are ready. There's a phrase that you see over and over. People love to repeat it in the press and so on, that, you know, the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. So the Liberal Party was neither liberal nor a party, right? It was a law firm with a ballot line, right? Basically, I mean, a couple of things had happened. One is it had basically atrophied, right? We talked already about its base shrinking. So its base shrunk. Once upon a time, it had like clubs in all the assembly districts. It had clubs in the unions. In the 80s and 90s, not so much, you know. So there were fewer and fewer people, right? At the same time, the people who had been most interested in the kind of ideological commitment to a certain kind of liberalism or social democracy, some of them had died off. Dubinsky, Rose. There was a power struggle in the party, and the Reverend Donald Harrington was lost, was ousted. And really the people, so it had always been a top-down party. So now the top was very few, even fewer people, and really it got down to this one guy, Ray Harding, who had long been active in the party, but he becomes really the boss of the party. And he's not so interested in the ideology anymore. He's not so interested in liberalism or the platform anymore. He's interested in the wheeling and dealing, right? And this had always been part of the party, but this takes over.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So there's two things that happen. One is that it's maybe not so liberal anymore. The other thing is starting to become a little bit more corrupt, right? Where getting jobs and getting money is kind of the main interest, you know, in who they back and so on. I should say about Giuliani, by the way, though, in '89, they thought they're going to run against Koch, and Giuliani is going to outflank Koch from the left, right? I think this is my left, I don't know if it's your left. Outflank Koch from the left. And also Koch was, although he had been always a reformer, he was, if you remember in the late 80s, there were some scandals that kind of rubbed off on him. They thought we're going to run a reform campaign. We're going to outflank Koch from the left. A lot of liberals liked Giuliani because he had gone after Wall Street when he was prosecutor. And so really it was like, you know, it was like the old days. But what happened was David Dinkins beat Koch in the Democratic primary. And so then the game plan shifted, and Giuliani ran as the law and order candidate, as candidate from the right. And they stuck with him, and they were, that was their last hurrah. They were very influential in his administration.
The one group that seems like a logical set of allies for the Liberal Party in the 60s and 70s is Reform Democrats. And yet it doesn't seem to make that big a difference in the history of the party. Why didn't that matter more?
Well, they were kind of rivals for similar space with the Reform Democrats. And I would say that what some of them told me is that they kind of like the liberals. The Liberal Party was at once kind of more ideologically consistent and at the same time more pragmatic. So they saw that the Reform Democrats as kind of both kind of mushy in their thinking, but also rigid in their sectarianism. And they were very fractious, and they were always splitting and, having faction fights and things like that. So they liked the Liberal Party in that way. I should say that, sometimes they work together and sometimes they opposed each other. But they were competing for similar demographics. So the Reform Democrats were also mostly Jewish, mostly a little younger, and more educated. But also some of that politics did rub off in the Liberal Party, and there were a faction for a while, the liberals from New Politics, that had very similar politics to the Reform Democrats. But most of them left after a while when they saw it was futile,
You talked about Ray Harding's tenure as the leader of the Liberal Party towards the end, and it seems as if the ending is somewhat shabby compared to the ideals of the beginning. Yet the party had significant electoral victories. I mean, Lindsay and Javits. Are there cultural things that the party left? Is there any sort of positive remnant of it to be found, in its history or its institutions or people that are important to note, even though the party itself vanished?
Well, the party was part of this. First of all, the party was part of this social democratic coalition in New York, that Josh Freeman and other historians have talked about, that New York had this very advanced social democracy. It took care of people, took care of working people, took care of poor people, public housing, rent regulation, health plans, some governments, some not, health plans, free education, all kinds of things. The Liberal Party didn't invent that. They weren't the only ones. They were part of that, right? So whatever's left of that, and it's very frayed around the edges for sure. I think the Liberal Party is part of that legacy. The other thing, of course, is that this electoral strategy is still alive in New York. And there are a couple of parties that still do this. So on the right, there's the Conservative Party that very much, from the 1960s when it was founded, they looked at the liberals and they said, we could do that too, the Republican Party in New York is too liberal and we're going to pull them to the right. And they did. And then the other, I don't know if you consider that positive or not, Rob, I don't know the other people, but then there's also now the Working Families Party, and that's on the left. It's also kind of Labor Party. It's exactly trying to occupy this space that the Liberal Party did. But I was told off the record by someone that it was involved in the Working Families Party, that it was kind of his nightmare that they would end up like the Liberal Party. So I think at the beginning, they were very conscious of both the legacy, both positive and negative, of the Liberal Party.
So what would the Working Families Party have to be aware of today to avoid becoming what the Liberal Party became?
Well, one thing I think that they were aware of from the beginning was that the Liberal Party became very hung up on patronage jobs. And Alex Rose would defend this and say, well, what's wrong with that? Party exists to put its people in power. And this is how we do it. We get our people in influential positions and they carry out, and we have good people, and that's good. But it became the kind of symbol of their generation where that became the whole reason for existence, And so that's one thing I think that the Working Families Party has tried to avoid. Now, there have been other issues, with the Working Families Party that some people might think were similar in terms of like consulting firms that had connections with the party and things like that. But, they certainly, the founders of the Working Families Party were certainly conscious of all of these pitfalls, yeah.
Looking at the history of the Liberal Party, would you recommend that other states adopt the cross-endorsement policy that you can have in New York State?
I think it's great. What can I say? I think it makes things more interesting. And it introduces this kind of like, I get the Conservative Party, there's a Labor Party. I think it makes things interesting. I don't know how many New Yorkers agree with me. And in other states, as you know, like in New York, at least you have to be a registered member of a party to vote in the primary. I think the trend is, the opposite, to kind of muddy the parties even more, right? So that they matter even less. So, that might be a matter of personal taste.
We're a long way from the New York City that gave birth to the Liberal Party, and New York's Jewish community has changed in many ways since then. So how has the place of politically engaged Jews in New York City changed from those early years of the Liberal Party? What's it look like today in contrast?
It's very, very different, right? So Jews were the backbone of kind of liberal politics in New York, right? Of course, not everyone, et cetera, but they, as a group, they were, right? Famous line from 1940, right, in Yiddish, that the Jews have drei Welten, three worlds. Die Welt, this world, jene Welt, the next world, and Roosevelt, right? And this carries on next several decades. Jews are the backbone of liberalism in New York. This gets shaken up starting in the 1960s, but it's become much more apparent lately. So Jews are very divided. Orthodox Jews, tend to vote much more conservatively. And if you look especially at, let's say, an electoral map of Brooklyn, it's out there online. Everyone can look it up. 2016, Brooklyn is like 80-something% Democratic. Where is the belt that votes for Trump? The red, as in the backwards way of American politics, the red belt. It's the Orthodox neighborhoods and the Russian immigrant neighborhood, Jewish immigrant neighborhoods of Brooklyn, right? A few other pockets. So that's, and I think given that over 60% of children, Jewish children in New York are in Orthodox households, this is, maybe the future of like the Jewish vote in New York. It's much more conservative than it was before.
So Magda's been monitoring the chat and she's been picking up questions from people. Let's hear what's out there.
Yes, so there are a couple of comments that some people remember their mothers or family members being members of the party. One person notes that their mother was a Liberal Party delegate from Jackson Heights in the 60s. So there are a couple of questions. One is from our colleague, actually, Daniel, about the policies of the party in the 70s, at the sort of late years during the fiscal crisis. I think you answered the question, why did the party die out, which was part of the question in 1983 in terms of, but I wonder whether you want to add something to it, and whether the anti-communist socialist was still central to its identity then, that is in the 1970s and 80s.
Two questions. One is, how do they respond to the fiscal crisis and so on? So the party always had like a program, right? They took positions on all kinds of issues. They took it very seriously at the beginning. They would send it out to all the politicians. They would check to see what the politicians, agreed with it or not. And it was a kind of social democratic program: rent regulation, public housing, cooperative housing, free education from kindergarten through college, cheap public transportation, all of these kinds of things. And they continued to believe that in the 1970s. But of course, this was the end of social democratic New York in a lot of ways, and they were on the defensive. And I should say they're also aging, and so they opposed the austerity measures and so on, but there was not much they could do about it. What was the?
And then whether the anti-communist socialism was still central to their identity.
This is kind of interesting because by that time, I think things, maybe had faded a little bit. This is still, yes, a little bit. So that's people like Bella Abzug. People remember Bella Abzug. A lot of them didn't like her because she came out of this kind of popular front, kind of pro-Soviet tradition in her youth. But some of them, when she ran for senator, they wanted to back her because she was the most consistent. They thought she was a strong candidate. And there was one guy, Henry Foner, who was from the Furriers Union. And some people here may remember his brother, he and his brothers were like all very well-known kind of left-wing trade unionists, or one was a historian actually, coming out of the communists. He joined the Liberal Party. He was a friend of Alex Rose, and he hadn't become an anti-communist. And I actually asked him, how was it even possible, first of all, that you would want to be in the Liberal Party? And second of all, that they would let you be in the Liberal Party, And he couldn't really answer me. He didn't really have an answer to that. So, I would say it was fading. And by the 80s, it didn't matter at all, because it wasn't the ideology yet. Rose died at the end of 1976. Dubinsky, I don't know when he passed away, but he had retired from the union already in the 60s. The director of the party, Ben Davidson, who was an old communist and loves tonight, ex-communist, retired. Harding didn't give about this at all, right? He just wanted the jobs and the money.
And then a question, where the Liberal Party and liberals demonize the way sometimes self-styled democratic socialists and progressives are today. It even rhymes.
Way today. So, well, in certain circles, yeah. But they also had big circles. Liberal was not a dirty word. Liberal was Roosevelt, people fought over the label. And in the 40s, the liberals, there was a phrase that they used over and over, a fighting liberal.
Yeah.
Right? Because everyone was a liberal in New York. It's like Tammany was liberal, everyone was liberal. But what they wanted was a fighting liberal, someone who would really push the agenda forward, health insurance, let's say, which was like the unfinished thing of the New Deal. So they wanted a fighting liberal. So they owned that label. It was really later on when liberalism in some, mainly white working class, white Catholic especially, but also white Jewish, which is what changes in the 60s, working class kind of circles, liberalism becomes this kind of dirty word because it's associated with profligacy, with cultural degeneration, all those kinds of things, counterculture, opposition to, anti-Americanism, things like this, pandering to minorities. Then it starts to become a dirty word in certain circles, some of which had been the liberals' prime constituency. There's a button that they put out. I think it was Bush 1 who kind of used this word about Dukakis, his opponent, that he was, quote, hopelessly liberal. Unquote. It may have been locally against Bob Abrams in this state. Hopelessly liberal, right? Hopelessly liberal. So there was a button that put out by the Liberal Party that said hopelessly liberal. They continued to kind of own it, but they also, in the archives, that's why it's good to go through the archives, there's like reports and correspondence, maybe they'll change their name, they don't like this name anymore and so on, but they never.
Did Lindsay win in 1965 because of votes Buckley got from conservative Democrats?
Partly, yeah. There was basically a three-way race. Abraham Beame, who later became the first Jewish mayor of New York, but was nominated by the Democrats. But he was kind of, middle of the road machine kind of guy. Lindsay was this charismatic, squeaky clean, liberal Republican from Manhattan. And William Buckley was nominated and so Lindsay got Republican and liberal, and William Buckley from the National Review got the conservative nomination. And he showed that this was a force, even in New York City. He got, I think 13% or something like that of the vote, like in the teens, in a three-way race, like for a minor party. He got the Conservative Party base was really mainly Catholic. So he got a lot of white Catholic votes, and some white Jewish votes as well. And he showed that this was a force. He drew from Republicans who didn't like Lindsay, but I don't know if anyone's really exactly sure, but he certainly drew a lot from people who had been traditionally Democratic voters as well.
Mm-hmm. So as you were talking about the sort of shifting parties and what they become, someone asked a question, not about the Liberal Party, but about the Republican Party. If Ronald Reagan wouldn't recognize the Republican Party these days, what would you imagine Javits and Keating say? How would they view it?
Yeah, that's, the Republican Party in New York was pretty liberal. The liberals never backed Rockefeller, but they flirted with him a little bit, but Javits and Lindsay, and there were others as well. Lefkowitz, people may remember Lefkowitz, people like that. And Lindsay, but their defeats in the Republican primaries were steps in this direction in the Republican Party. So in 69, Lindsay lost the Republican primary. In 1980, Javits lost the Republican primary. And this was the turning point. These were like steps along the way. In 1970, of course, the Conservative Party candidate, James Buckley, William's brother, was elected to the United States Senate, running solely on the conservative line. The Liberals once again had backed the Republican, Charles Goodell, who split the vote with the Liberal Democrat, and they helped to, and they elected this conservative. So yeah, this plays out in the Republican Party in New York. But like you said, these were steps towards the Reagan Republican Party. I don't know about the Trump Republican Party. Yeah, that's a different thing. I imagine some of them would have, speculation, but someone like Javits might have changed parties. But
so who are the heirs to the Liberal Party today?
Well, there's no direct heirs, but the indirect heirs are, I think, the Working Families Party. In some ways, some of these, they would disown them probably. But some of the socialists in the Democratic Party, like Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez and things like that, in some ways are. But there are significant kinds of differences that I think they wouldn't have been a comfortable fit together. But in terms of trying to inject a kind of social democratic politics into mainstream, they are in a way some of the heirs.
Okay, I think we've gone through. Oh no, there's one fact question. Was Jay Lovestone involved in the Liberal Party?
I see we have a very, very, audience that's very educated on these things. Yes, so for people who don't know, Jay Lovestone was the General Secretary of the American Communist Party in the 1920s. He was expelled for right deviationism. Okay, he backed the wrong horse in the power struggle in the Soviet Union, and he was expelled. And he had his own kind of sect, right, the Lovestonites. In the 1930s, they called themselves the Communist (opposition). By 1940, they looked around at each other and they did something that these small sects almost never do. They said, why are we doing this? Makes no sense. So they disbanded. But they knew each other still. And they remained kind of these anti-Soviet, anti-Stalinist, anti-communist social democrats. And so in the Ladies Garment Workers Union, they were prominent. Charles Zimmerman. In the AFL-CIO, Lovestone became the foreign policy person in the AFL-CIO. And in the Liberal Party, there was Ben Davidson, who was the executive director of the party. And so there was this kind of Lovestonite presence and a little bit of Lovestonite kind of mafia in the party. My great uncle Cy Beagle was very big in the teachers union, and he was a former Lovestonite. And there are letters in the archives writing to Ben Davidson, Ben, he was a teacher, so I want a summer job. Could you get me a summer job at like Unity House or something like this, So yes, there was a Lovestonite presence in the Liberal Party.
So as you could tell, the audience was very informed and involved in this. But as someone who came really from the outside of this, I wonder whether both you could briefly tell people like me, why the study of the party and why the book matters. Why should we take it and read it and get the 30% off?
Well, I think it's part of, it's important on a couple levels. If you're interested in New York, which everyone should be, right? Because it is the most important thing in the United States, let alone city. This is part of New York's kind of, I can't say this even once, let alone 3 times, but New York's unique kind of contribution to American kind of politics and political culture, right? Anyone who's interested in the history of the left, right? As again, this is a thing where here were these people coming out of, what everyone was at the left, Socialist Party, trying to inject themselves into mainstream politics. How well did it work and for how long, right? These are a couple of reasons. And then the reasons why it didn't work are also, kind of interesting. Anyone interested, I think, in ethnic politics, he said this was not officially a Jewish party, but, kind of it was. We didn't get a chance to talk about its kind of sometimes tense relationship with Catholics in New York.
Yeah,
another big important group, but very different political culture. Mm-hmm. And sometimes they had a hard time talking to each other. Mm-hmm. So that's another aspect of the party that I think is interesting, all these kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Let me just add to that too, that it's a very good political history of New York City and New York State that really takes us from the 1930s to the recent past, and all the big evolutions and shifts that the city and state go through are reflected in the changing fortunes of the Liberal Party, which by its end, is not as admirable as it once was, but provides a real cautionary tale for anybody who wants to engage in third-party politics and understand both its benefits and the pitfalls that you can fall into.
Mm-hmm. So normally I would invite everybody to join us for a reception to celebrate. Alas, we can't do it. But I do hope, because we had so many books published in the COVID era where we were doomed to our own Zoom rooms, that maybe next year we will gather and raise the glass to all of those books, including Daniel's 2 books. So I want to thank you, Robert, for joining us, Daniel, for sharing your work with us and for being such a great colleague, and for all of you for joining us today and our other many events. And I hope you'll join us next season as well. So again, thank you so much, and raise the glass, I guess, on your own, but we'll do it next year. All right. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.